Hi there, friends. I do hope that you have had a good start to your 2025. Today, I'm going to be talking to Liesl Pretorius, and she's joining us to discuss religious freedom and how that's been threatened by online censorship. It's always good to speak to you, Liesl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Recognizing that this topic is hot, I've been seeing a little bit of conversation around censorship on Twitter as well as on Facebook. I'm looking forward to engaging with you, and thanks for the time that you spend just engaging with us as an audience, making us aware of what's going on in the broader conversations happening in South Africa and beyond. Maybe we could start off with the question, is it fair to say that we live in an age of censorship?
Well, Mark, I think not an age of censorship. That sounds a bit dramatic, but I understand why people are using that term because free speech advocates, especially overseas, they have identified that there is a rising trend, which is a concerning trend of global censorship. And this is often done in the name of curbing fake news and stopping misinformation and disinformation. Some are even calling it the industrial censorship complex. I don't know if I would go that far, but I can understand why people, especially in other nations, might say that. South Africa, thankfully, but overseas, very concerning trends. And of course, for SA, we come from the religious freedom point of view. When information and speech is starting to be censored and things like that, what does that mean for religious views? Who are the people who are the self-appointed arbiters of truth? And are they influenced by political agendas and other motivations? Um, so, for example, some of these free speech advocates and people who do a very good job to defend free speech, they said that, government agencies in some countries and even powerful private actors, social media platforms, um, or even worse, a combination of these two, use these very vague buzzwords like misinformation, disinformation, fake news as an excuse for censorship. And it's been seen in government, it's been seen in universities, think tanks, NGOs. So major places or institutions that shape public discourse ultimately shape culture. And we've, read online in newsletters, news reports about people who held views that are not necessarily favored by those who are politically empowered in a certain nation. And then they are deplatformed, they are debanked, even their bank accounts closed, they're blacklisted, they refuse business, etc. And I'll give a few examples. So, for example, last year in Brazil, there was a judge of the Supreme Court, and he suspended the social media platform X, or formerly Twitter, across the country because Twitter or X declined to censor certain views because they're very pro free speech. And according to the justice, X posed a real danger to influencing the electorate with massive misinformation, according to this judge. But that's very concerning because this opens the door to widespread suppression of speech. Very concerning. Thankfully, that ban was lifted. So I understand why there are people who are saying we're living in the age of censorship. In the United States, the U.S. Department of Justice has reportedly pressured Facebook, Twitter, Google into silencing dissenting voices on a wide range of hot button cultural issues, hot topics, contentious issues such as climate change, abortion, economic policy, gender identity, and COVID-19, pressurizing big tech companies to suppress views that powerful persons in government do not like. And even on the academic front, academic freedom is so important. A major Christian lobby group in the United States that do incredible work. They're representing several medical doctors who published articles in a peer-reviewed medical journal, and their articles were accepted and praised even. But the articles focused on the dangers of abortion drugs or chemical abortion. And then, after these articles were published, after the fact, the publisher of the articles received complaints about the author's pro-life affiliations. And then the publisher retracted these articles and even removed one of the authors from its board of directors. which is very concerning. And there's also been issues around, free speech on campus, etc. And very recently, last week even, TikTok was banned nationwide across the United States because the previous administration had concerns over potential data collection and influence on operations of the government by the People's Republic of China. And that ban has since been lifted. So these are real things that are happening. I think in South Africa, thankfully, we are still been protected from a lot of this, but these are trends happening overseas, and we are not isolated. So I think we need to be aware of them.
Look, I mean, when I think of the power of social media and the distance that speech can travel, and just its absolute dominance over society now. I was watching the inauguration of Donald Trump, which was on Monday, and seated right there alongside the US president are Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, founders and owners of Twitter and Facebook. We are talking about incredibly powerful platforms. So I understand why free speech is so important and free speech on those platforms. But maybe just for the benefit of those who are listening in, what are the concerns about limiting speech? Why should this bother us at all?
Well, freedom of expression is a foundational human right and a democratic right. It is a hallmark of any free and equal society. If you don't have the right to freedom of expression, many of your other fundamental rights basically become meaningless. Your political rights, freedom of religion becomes meaningless because you won't have freedom of religious expression, for example. And when we talk legally, in a legal sense, about expression, it has a very wide meaning. It's not just freedom of speech, it's expression. Expression is wider than just speech. Um, so very, very important. And if you cannot express yourself, your thoughts, your opinions, and ideas, it's how can you? It affects your equality. It affects your human dignity. It affects your way to meaningfully contribute and engage in society. And in societies where you don't have freedom of expression, closely correlated to that freedom of religion. Those are your totalitarian societies, societies that are not very free, dictatorships, for example, oppressive regimes. So it's an absolutely fundamental cornerstone. I'm right. So in any way that it is being threatened, should raise some red flags.
We just go back a little bit and just redefine, just so that I understand as well, freedom of speech and freedom of expression, how they're the same and how they're different.
So freedom of speech, I think that's just the term that people commonly use, freedom of
Yeah.
speech, but in the Constitution, we actually use freedom of expression. And expression is wider than speech because speech is words, but expression can be arts, it can be gestures, it can be music. So many, it could be a dance, can be an expressive thing, or a symbol, a certain picture or a symbol is also a form of expression. So it's much, much wider than just the words that somebody speaks.
So when you talk about symbols and we talk about South Africa, I can think of times that maybe expression is limited. But maybe you can answer that question. Aren't there instances where it's a good idea to limit speech or expression?
Well, I must say that, South Africa, our constitution has a very broad protection of freedom of expression, which is a very good thing. But our constitution also recognizes implicitly that any fundamental right, or especially it recognizes that any fundamental right can be limited, but it can only be limited subject to certain ways because fundamental rights are so important. In the article in our constitution that protects freedom of expression, for example, there are certain specifically listed protected expressions. And then there are certain forms of expression that are unprotected expression. That means that those kinds of unprotected expression can be regulated, they can be limited. And there are three types. First, propaganda for war. Secondly, hate speech. And thirdly, incitement of imminent violence. And it is, I think, logically apparent why these forms of expression can be legally and lawfully limited. The question will come down to, for example, something like hate speech. Is it hate speech properly define within the parameters of the Constitution that's being limited or not. You have to stick to within the scope of the Constitution, but it recognizes there are instances, there are certain types of speech that people basically use as weapons. And in a free democratic society, it's not unfettered freedom. It's freedom within certain reasonable bounds. And there's a careful balance there of balancing different people's rights and freedoms to maximum freedoms of all and to protect the democratic and constitutional order that we have. And always when you do limit speech, for example, concerning something like, say, hate speech, you have to think about when you write the definitions that they're very tight, that you don't open the door, Pandora's box to detrimental consequences that you did not foresee, or led in some sort of Trojan horse. So yes, definitely there are certain types of speech that can be limited, and there's a very good reason for that. But when speech is limited, we have to be very careful that we limit them within the parameters set by the Constitution.
I mean, it's such a super interesting conversation and so relevant. It's a conversation I imagine is going to be in the news ongoing in South Africa because of that balancing and the tension of individuals' rights. I love the way that you put it. The tension of individuals' rights played off against the rights of all, or the need to protect these rights for all. I found that interesting, and I guess it's in the tension that there's a rub, and that cases come before the court and need to be argued out, and there's a bit of give and take over time in terms of ebbs and flows, how this is interpreted. For a moment, can we turn our attention to online censorship? We've definitely, I love the social kind of sphere, the Twitters and the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the YouTubes. We have definitely over time seen censorship on those platforms, and I would imagine many other platforms. I only refer to those because they're the biggest. But what are the implications of online censorship with regards to religious freedom in particular?
Well, our concern as a legal advocacy organization that upholds religious freedom in South Africa and related rights is wherever freedom of expression is threatened, it will obviously and per implication threaten expression of religious freedom as well. So in the context of online platforms, these massive platforms that millions and millions, billions of people use, the concern is that if there is censorship, whether from the state or from private actors such as these platforms themselves, it can suppress and silence religious views. Religious views that in terms of, the country where that person's resident, their laws or international law are legitimate views and should not be limited. This can lead to unfair discrimination. It can lead to excluding or sanctioning persons of faith, almost treating them as second-class citizens. Lead to them being blocked and banned or thrown into the infamous Facebook jail and being deplatformed. And you don't want that. Like we said, there are instances, there are certain limits to speech. If somebody is literally spewing hate speech, that should not be protected. But it's often in these gray areas where somebody perhaps has an unpopular view or a view that's contrary to the dominant narrative or the kind of political nuances or flavor of a season or a moment, and it's a lawful view. It's something that is actually constitutionally protected, but the platform or the persons who happen to be in power at that stage, they don't like that, or some powerful actor, then that view gets suppressed. And that's not what we want in a free marketplace of ideas. It's not a good thing. And what is also very insidious is if this establishes a culture of fear-induced self-censorship, that this has been internalized to the extent that people are afraid to express themselves, that would be a sad day for religious freedom. It would be a sad day for freedom of expression, and it would just be a sad day for human rights and democracy.
I loved some of what you just said. This idea of a free market of ideas. I thought that was a great phrase. And you just think of all the benefits of a free market to the economy, the benefits of a free market to intellectual thinking, and how that spurs humanity and us as a culture forward. This ability to have engagement with one another, and how censorship really clamps down on that and represses and suppresses that. So I really enjoyed that line of conversation. Thank you very much, Liesl. So, I mean, in the famous words of Bob Dylan, times they are changing. We've seen a kind of a political shift in the United States. And it just so happens at the same time that we've heard of some changes to one of the larger social platforms, which, I mean, the timing is so fascinating. But maybe you could just unpack that for us a little bit. Facebook is reportedly clawing back on some of its censorship. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? What's the benefits? What's the advantage? What's the change?
Yeah, so recently, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, I think it was during an interview with Joe Rogan, he revealed that of former President Biden's staffers apparently bullied, screamed, swore at Meta workers when they refused to censor accurate posts and memes about COVID-19 vaccines. That's very troubling. Why do you have government staffers swearing at your staff? And Mark Zuckerberg also recently is he committed to winding back of this on the self-censorship across Meta's platform. So, it comes from the government, that's one side, but also the self-censorship to roll back on that. He admitted that their third-party fact checkers that they employ to moderate content were too political, and that these political views influenced how content was moderated, obviously in a biased way, not treated even-handedly. So it's very good that Facebook has acknowledged this and said, it's time to get back to the roots of freedom of expression. And we hope that this will dramatically reduce the amount of censorship that Facebook employs from its fact checkers, from the platform side. And we also hope that under the new administration, there won't be that sort of government interference, that there will be a real commitment to freedom of expression. Because, people have landed in this infamous Facebook jail or have just been banned, lifetime bans off Facebook. For example, one gentleman named Stephen Ertelt, and he was banished from Facebook because he shared a video claiming that an unborn child is more than just a clump of cells, and he was banned off Facebook. And that's a legitimate Christian view. And it has a place, in the free marketplace of ideas and views that should be allowed on Facebook. So it's something to be grateful for when the big social media platforms start to do this. And if there are other platforms that do still censor, one would hope that they will follow suit. And hopefully under this new administration, there will be more scope for that.
Look, America certainly sets the trends, sets the agenda in many ways for the rest of the world, just in terms of the dominance of their culture. But can we bring the conversation a little bit closer to home? How are things going in South Africa? What's 4SA's appraisal of the landscape? Is censorship something that we need to be worried about? Do you guys have concerns about where we are as a country? Give us the litmus test, the lay of the land.
Well, as you rightly said, Mark, we are influenced by cultures of other nations, especially very dominant nations such as the US. So anything that happens there potentially affects us, spillovers to us. But I think in South Africa, we have a lot to be grateful for. Generally, there isn't censorship concerns. We have very strong protections of freedom of expression, freedom of religion. But there's a notable exception, of course, in our view, the Hate Speech Act, which is a new law, not that new, 2023. It is law already. It's not yet operable. But this Hate Speech Act criminalizes hate speech. And problem is that even though the intention of the act is perhaps a good intention to address real hate speech, its definition is so vague and broad that it captures speech that is not hate speech. So then it criminalizes speech that is constitutionally legitimate, that people are allowed to utter. And it has weak exemption clauses, including for freedom of religion. And we are concerned that like I said, it's a criminal law. If you're found guilty of hate speech in terms of the Hate Speech Act, you could be sent to jail for up to 5 years for something that you said. So we are concerned about the potential weaponization of this Hate Speech Act in its current form against persons of faith, especially on topics that are perhaps more contentious and where people have strongly diverging views, such as marriage and gender and etc. And we also are concerned that because it's a criminal law, it might have a chilling effect on freedom of speech, and people might start to self-censor. And we really don't want that for our hard-won democracy. But I think that is the biggest concern that we have, and it is quite a concern. It is something that needs to be addressed. But overall, we have very strong protections of freedom of speech in South Africa, and we certainly intend to work hard towards keeping it that way.
Well, maybe don't stop there. It would be interesting to hear how you guys intend to work hard, because I think you've introduced an idea to me, and this idea of self-censorship and just the dangers of self-censorship. So not just that you're worried that you might get caught and go to jail if you say the wrong thing, and in reality, all the issues that you mentioned. I'm a conservative evangelical Christian. I mean, this touches this touches very close to home. But the idea of self-censorship is just as worrying. The idea that you wouldn't speak the fullness of God's word because you're worried that it might get you into trouble. In other words, the world isn't actually coming against you; you're coming against yourself just because there's the chance that that you could land in trouble. How is FOSA involved in this particular battle, and maybe even extend it a little bit beyond that? How can people that are listening in today get involved in speaking against this? Because in reality, we live in a democracy. Our voice gets to be heard. We are the people. This democracy needs to work for us. So how can we get involved in this?
Yes, certainly. And I think, as you rightly said, that's so worrying when that fear becomes internalized and it sets a trend for other people. The more people are afraid, the more people will be afraid. So it's good to stand up for your rights and freedoms. So what we do is we continue to do what we do. We monitor international, or do we monitor the developments and trends locally and internationally, and as it concerns freedom of religion and related rights, especially on the law and policy landscape, because we are a legal advocacy organization. And if something comes up on the radar and there's an opportunity for public engagement, we do our submissions and we lobby and we consult and we engage to defend our right to freedom of religion and related rights. And we raise awareness and we try to educate the public about their rights. And especially with this hate speech bill, we are in advanced talks with other peer organizations who are also very passionate about defending freedom of expression, about what can we do to have this hate speech act amended, to have the problematic aspects of the act addressed. And you ask, what could listeners do or viewers do? I think it's important to know what your rights are. And not to be afraid, to continue to speak the truth in love. There are better ways to express yourself. The same idea, you can express it in a better way or a worse way, but continue to speak the truth in love and don't self-censor out of fear. I think that is important. If you are not undermining somebody else's inherent dignity and equality, then I think that, because that's what hate speech basically, if I have to sum it up in a way, is against. And we certainly do recognize the inherent dignity and quality of all people. And what listeners also, or viewers also can do is they can follow 4SA, they can support 4SA so that they know when these things are happening. And for example, if there's opportunity to engage for the public to engage in one of these issues, we try to always make it easy for the public to engage and raise their voice, because everyone's voice is important in a participatory democracy such as ours.
Liesl, great conversation. Very, very interesting, very relevant, very, very apt to today. So thank you so much for having it with us. I do want to point anyone who gets this far on the podcast to the 4SA website. That's 4SA, F-O-R-S-A, 4SA.org.za. And on the website, you can get articles, you can get videos, you can sign up to a newsletter, you can find out about how to get involved in even supporting 4SA. Great work that you guys are doing. So strength to your arm. I do hope you and the team at 4SA have a wonderful 2025. Thank you so much for the work that you do. I trust the Lord blesses you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the wishes, and hope the Lord blesses you and the viewers as well.